What if the first words humans ever wrote were never meant to be the beginning? What if they were the last story of a world already ending, pressed into wet clay by hands that knew time was running out? In the deserts of southern Iraq, where silence feels heavier than sand, the ruins of ancient cities still hold their breath. Under fallen walls and wind-blown plains rest tens of thousands of clay pieces. Each one is marked with wedge-shaped marks that look almost like bird footprints pressed into mud. These marks are called cuneiform, and they contain the oldest continuous records of human thought we've ever found. But here's what makes them strange. They don't read like beginnings. Before we go further, if you enjoy stories where history refuses to make sense, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're listening in the dark somewhere, drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I want to picture this mystery stretching across time zones while you drift toward sleep. The discovery didn't happen with fanfare. It happened with dust. In the late 1800s, European archaeologists working near the ancient site of Uruk began digging up brick mounds that had baked under the Iraqi sun for thousands of years. When they broke through the surface, they found rooms filled with clay tablets stacked, organized, and carefully preserved, thousands upon thousands of them, each no larger than a paperback book, each covered in detailed writing. When scholars finally translated the language, they realized they weren't reading the clumsy first attempts of a new civilization learning to write. They were reading tax records, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, legal contracts, and hymns to gods whose names had been forgotten for 4,000 years. They called the people who wrote these tablets the Sumerians. And from the moment that name entered our textbooks, something in our understanding of history began to crack, because Sumer doesn't appear gradually. It appears complete. Around 3,500 BC, seemingly overnight in archaeological terms, cities emerge across southern Mesopotamia with urban planning, monumental architecture, advanced irrigation, and a mathematical system based on the number 60 that we still use to measure time and angles today. Their cuneiform script contains over 700 symbols in its earliest known form. Their temple complexes align precisely with celestial events. Their trade networks stretch from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This is not how civilizations are supposed to begin. History loves slow progressions, stone tools leading to bronze, simple shelters evolving into cities, pictographs gradually becoming alphabets. But Sumer skips the rehearsal. It walks on stage already knowing its lines. Scholars have spent over a century trying to explain this. Some suggest we simply haven't found the earlier developmental stages yet, that erosion and time have erased the fumbling centuries. Others propose that Sumer inherited knowledge from neighboring cultures whose names are lost to flood and ruin. But the Sumerians themselves offer a different explanation, written in their own hand. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. This is the restoration of what was before, not invention. Restoration, as if everything they built was an act of remembering. Picture yourself in a museum archive late at night when the halls echo with emptiness. You pull on cotton gloves and lift one of these tablets from its padded tray. The clay is cool, slightly rough. Along its surface, hundreds of tiny wedge marks catch the light, each one pressed deliberately by a reed stylus held in a hand that hasn't existed for 5,000 years. And if you look closely enough at certain tablets, you can still see them. Fingerprints, thumbprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The ridges and valleys of a Sumerian scribe, preserved like a fossil. That person lived before the pyramids, before the Minoans, before Chinese dynasties or Mesoamerican pyramids, and they were recording something they believed was important enough to survive them. Among those records are astronomical tables tracking Venus with accuracy we didn't achieve again until the age of telescopes. There are multiplication tables teaching students how to calculate compound interest. There are medical texts describing surgeries and prescribing plant-based remedies. There are myths describing how humanity was fashioned from clay mixed with divine essence. Stories that contain trial and error, failed prototypes, adjustments made across generations, and running through almost everything they wrote is a recurring theme. A world before the flood, when knowledge flowed freely, when rulers lived for impossible lengths of time, when those who came from the heavens taught humanity how to measure the stars. It's easy to dismiss mythology as fantasy, but when the same story appears across continents, in Akkadian tablets, Hebrew scripture, Hindu Vedas, and even Mesoamerican codices, the repetition begins to sound less like coincidence and more like shared memory carried by survivors across thousands of miles. In the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur when his team struck something unexpected. A layer of clean flood silt over 2 meters thick, deposited between distinct occupation layers. The same sterile clay appears at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Eridu, all dated to roughly the same period the Sumerians described in their flood myths. It wasn't global, but it was catastrophic enough to reset civilization across an entire region. What makes this discovery unsettling is what it implies, that the Sumerians weren't mythologizing, they were documenting. Their tablets describe a world divided into before and after, separated by water and devastation, and everything they rebuilt, every city, every temple, every star chart, was an attempt to salvage what had been lost. When archaeologists uncovered the ziggurat at Uruk, they expected primitive foundations. Instead, they found 6 miles of defensive walls, water systems engineered with mathematical precision, and a temple complex aligned to track the winter solstice. Buried in a collapsed library, they discovered over 40,000 tablets, an archive vast enough to document every aspect of daily life, trade, ritual, and cosmic observation. But nowhere in those tablets do the Sumerians describe inventing their knowledge. They describe receiving it, preserving it, restoring it from fragments. One phrase appears repeatedly across temple inscriptions and royal dedications carved into stone meant to outlast empires. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not creation. As if the Sumerians saw themselves not as pioneers, but as archaeologists of an earlier age, digging through the rubble of catastrophe to recover what their ancestors had known. Inside a quiet gallery in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. Its surface is covered in cuneiform dedication text describing the construction of a temple to Inanna, goddess of the evening star. But nestled between the formal language of kingship and prayer is that phrase again, the restoration of what was before. And if you lean close enough to the glass, close enough that your breath fogs the surface, you can see them, the fingerprints of the scribe who shaped this cylinder 4,500 years ago, pressed into the wet clay before it hardened forever. Those ridges and valleys belong to someone who believed they were saving something, not creating it, saving it. Maybe that's why these tablets still whisper to us across millennia. They weren't meant to announce a new beginning. They were meant to preserve the memory of what had come before, a world so thoroughly erased by time and disaster that only fragments survived, pressed into clay by hands that understood what it means to be the last generation that remembers. At night, when the museum lights dim and the halls fall silent, I imagine those tablets breathing in the darkness, each one a time capsule, each one a message from a people who knew they were rebuilding on top of ruins. We think of ourselves as standing at the cutting edge of history, pushing forward into an unknown future. But maybe we're standing at the far end of a story that began long before we learned to write it down. A story the Sumerians tried desperately to preserve before it disappeared completely. And as the wind moves across the empty plains where Eridu and Uruk once stood, carrying dust from civilizations that rose and fell and rose again, you can almost hear what those ancient scribes were trying to tell us. This is not the beginning. This is what we managed to save. So let us return to the clay, to the moment when silence broke and the oldest testimony began, to the deserts of southern Iraq, where everything we think we know about human origins was written once, and then buried for 3,000 years beneath the weight of empires that never knew the Sumerians had come before them. The clay tablets don't burn. They've survived fires that consumed the wooden shelves they rested on, floods that collapsed the mud brick archives around them, and the slow erosion of 5,000 years of wind. When a building caught fire in ancient Sumer, the heat didn't destroy their records. It baked them harder, preserving them like ceramics in a kiln. This is how memory survives. By accident, by catastrophe, by the very disasters meant to erase it. In the summer heat of southern Iraq, where temperatures push past 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the ruins of Uruk still rise from the desert floor in broken geometric shapes. Walls that once protected 80,000 people, temple platforms that once held ceremonies under star-filled skies. The sand here moves constantly, covering and uncovering, burying and revealing. And beneath it all, the clay waits. When archaeologists first began excavating these sites in the 1870s and 1880s, names like Hormuzd Rassam, Ernest D. Sarzik, and Robert Koldewey, they weren't expecting literature. They were looking for treasure, for statues, for gold. What they found instead were storage rooms filled with administrative debris, receipts, inventories, contracts. Boring, bureaucratic, unglamorous. But when the tablets were cleaned and cataloged, when linguists finally cracked the wedge-shaped script, the mundane dissolved into the extraordinary. A single tablet from Nippur lists the rations distributed to temple workers: barley, oil, wool. Beneath that, another records a student's mathematics homework, multiplication tables practicing squares and cube roots. Next to it, a medical text prescribes treatments for infections using combinations of thyme, cedar, and fermented barley. In the same archive, hymns praising Inanna, instructions for predicting lunar eclipses, a legal case involving disputed property boundaries, and a farmer's almanac advising when to irrigate based on seasonal flooding patterns. This wasn't a civilization finding its voice. This was a civilization already fluent in every dialect of knowledge. The earliest Sumerian tablets we found, dated to roughly 3,500 to 200 BC, contain sophisticated content from the very beginning. There are no primitive stages, no tentative experiments with symbols. The cuneiform system appears complete, capable of expressing abstract legal concepts, poetic metaphors, astronomical measurements, and administrative complexity all at once. Linguists call this anomalous. Writing systems are supposed to evolve. Egyptian hieroglyphs started as simple pictographs and gradually became more abstract over centuries. Chinese characters developed slowly from oracle bone scratches into the complex system we recognize today. Even our own alphabet traces its ancestry back through millennia of gradual transformation. But Sumerian cuneiform arrives on stage fully rehearsed. And it's not just the writing, it's what the writing describes. Among the tablets found at Uruk is a cadastral survey, a land registry documenting field boundaries, irrigation channels, and property ownership across the entire city-state. This requires not just literacy, but geometry, surveying techniques, standardized measurement units, and a bureaucracy sophisticated enough to maintain records across generations, all present from the earliest layers. Meanwhile, tablets from Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest Sumerian city, contain temple hymns that reference older temples, older gods, older rituals. The priests at Eridu didn't claim to be establishing something new. They claimed to be maintaining something ancient. One inscription from the Temple of Enki reads, "The house whose foundation was laid in the sacred place, whose ancient designs are carried forward from distant days, not built for the first time, not established here, but carried forward from distant days." Scholars initially dismissed this as religious poetry, the kind of language that makes institutions sound more venerable than they actually are. Temples everywhere claim ancient origins to bolster their authority, but the pattern repeats too consistently across Sumerian texts to be mere rhetoric. At Lagash, a boundary stone erected around 450 BC describes a treaty between rival city-states, but before detailing the new agreement, the inscription states, "The border that was established by the god Ningirsu in ancient times, this border is restored again." Restored, not created. At Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, where scribes trained for generations, temple inventories list sacred objects passed down from before the time of memory. Clay cones buried in temple foundations describe renovations of structures whose first builders are forgotten. The Sumerians consistently present themselves not as pioneers, but as custodians, caretakers of knowledge and practices that came from somewhere else, from some time earlier. from people whose names had already been lost. This humility would be unremarkable if Sumer emerged from a clear ancestral culture, but it doesn't. The Ubaid culture that preceded Sumer in the same region shows none of this sophistication. Their settlements were small farming villages with simple pottery and basic tools. Then, in what amounts to an archaeological blink, cities appear. Between Ubaid and Sumer, there's no gradual progression of increasingly complex villages. There's a discontinuity, a gap where, according to every developmental model of civilization, there should be centuries of awkward transition. Yet, the Sumerians themselves offer no creation story for their civilization. They don't have myths about discovering writing or inventing mathematics. Instead, their myths describe reception, being given knowledge, being taught by divine figures who descended from the heavens, bringing the tools of civilization already perfected. Enmerkar and the Lord of Orada contains a curious passage. Once upon a time, there was no snake, there was no scorpion, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror. Humankind had no rival. In those days, the land Shuber Hamazi, harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of divine decrees, the place of nobility, Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into the speech of humankind that until then had been one. This passage has puzzled scholars for over a century. It describes a unified humanity speaking one language, living without fear, in a world that existed before the one the Sumerians inhabited, and it positions Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, as the one who changed language, who introduced diversity where unity had been. It reads less like creation mythology and more like historical fragmentation, a memory of unity followed by division, of wholeness followed by scattering. When you sit with these tablets long enough, when you read translation after translation of temple hymns, king lists, legal documents, and astronomical tables, a pattern emerges that's difficult to ignore. The Sumerians never claimed to be the first. They claimed to be the ones who remembered. In a tablet from the scribal school at Nippur, a teacher instructs his students. From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. The words of the ancestors must be preserved, not created. Preserved. The clay remembers what we've forgotten, that the people who first taught us to write believed they were writing something down, not making something up. They believed they were preserving, restoring, carrying forward from distant days. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a legacy that preceded them, one interrupted by catastrophe, dimmed by time, but not entirely lost. And if they were right, if what they pressed into wet clay wasn't imagination, but documentation, then everything we thought we knew about humanity's beginning might be inverted. Maybe civilization didn't start with the Sumerians. Maybe it survived with them. Did the Sumerians record the true origin of humanity, not as myth, but as memory? To answer that, we need to confront just how impossible their sudden appearance really was, and why it breaks every rule we thought we understood about how civilizations are born. In the Nile Delta, archaeologists can trace Egyptian civilization backwards through distinct phases, like reading rings in a tree. First comes the Naqada III period around 200 BC, with its increasingly elaborate burials and early hieroglyphic experiments. Before that, Naqada II shows developing pottery styles and expanding trade networks. Further back, Naqada I reveals simple agricultural settlements, and beneath it all, the Badarian culture, primitive farmers with basic tools and seasonal camps. Each layer builds on the previous one. Each innovation emerges from what came before. You can follow the thread of development like climbing down a ladder, rung by rung, until you reach the ground floor. The first Egyptians learning to farm, to settle, to organize. The same pattern holds across the ancient world. In the Indus Valley, the great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro reached their peak around 500 BC with sophisticated urban planning, standardized brick sizes, and elaborate drainage systems, but they didn't appear overnight. Archaeologists have traced their origins through the early Harappan phase back to 300 BC, then further to pre-Harappan settlements like Mehrgar, a farming village that existed for over 2,000 years, slowly developing pottery, metallurgy, and trade before its descendants built the first true cities. In China, the Shang dynasty's elaborate bronze work and oracle bone inscriptions around 600 BC rest atop the Urlita culture, which itself grew from the Longshan culture, which emerged from the Yangshao culture stretching back to 50 BC, layer upon layer, century upon century, each stage preparing the ground for the next. This is how civilizations are supposed to work: accumulation, experimentation, gradual sophistication. A people doesn't wake up one morning knowing how to build cities. They learn through trial and error across generations, making mistakes and refining techniques until complexity becomes possible. And then there's Sumer. When archaeologists excavate Sumerian sites, they find the architectural equivalent of a completed symphony where there should be rehearsals and rough drafts. The city of Uruk, in its earliest substantial phase around 500 BC, already covers over 250 hectares, roughly 600 acres. Its defensive walls run for nearly 10 kilometers, constructed with millions of mud bricks that required quarrying, transport, standardized production, and coordinated labor involving thousands of workers. The mathematics alone is staggering. Building walls of that scale requires calculating volumes, managing supply chains, scheduling work crews, feeding workers, and maintaining the project across years or decades. This level of organization typically appears after centuries of smaller civic projects, temples, granaries, modest fortifications. But Uruk's walls are there from the beginning, as if the city's founders already knew precisely how to manage projects of breathtaking scale. Inside those walls, the layout reflects careful planning. Residential districts separated from industrial zones, temple complexes positioned at cardinal points, streets aligned to facilitate drainage. The Temple of Anu, built on a massive raised platform, shows sophisticated knowledge of load-bearing architecture. Its foundation required calculating weight distribution to prevent collapse, engineering knowledge that normally takes generations of building failures to acquire. Yet there are no collapsed proto-temples beneath it, no trial and error foundations, just competence from layer 1. At Eridu, traditionally considered the oldest Sumerian settlement, archaeologists expected to find the city's origins in simple shrines that gradually expanded into proper temples. Instead, even the earliest religious structure, Temple I, dated to roughly 50 BC in the Ubaid period, shows architectural knowledge: a central room with an altar, niches for offerings, and careful orientation. By the time Eridu enters the Sumerian period proper, Temple VII displays such sophisticated construction that it served as the blueprint for ziggurats built 1,000 years later. Where did they learn? The Ubaid settlements surrounding early Eridu were simple farming villages. None show monumental construction. None show the organizational capacity for major civic projects. Then Eridu appears, and suddenly there's institutional architecture that wouldn't look out of place in a mature civilization. Lagash offers the same pattern. Its earliest excavated levels reveal a city already engaged in complex irrigation management, with canals that require surveying, gradient calculation, and cooperative labor across multiple settlements. Irrigation sounds simple until you attempt it. Miscalculate the gradient and water won't flow. Dig too deep and you hit salt deposits that poison the soil. Fail to coordinate with neighboring cities and you spark water wars. The Lagash Canal system worked from the start. No catastrophic failures are buried in the archaeological record. No abandoned channels betraying miscalculation. Just functional water management that sustained tens of thousands of people. Contrast this with early Egyptian irrigation, which required centuries of experimentation, canals that silted up, basins that didn't fill properly, seasons where crops failed because the timing was wrong. The Egyptians learned through mistakes, adjusted, improved. Their agriculture became reliable through experience. Sumerian agriculture appears reliable from the beginning. The same is true for their writing. When cuneiform first appears in the archaeological record around 3,400 to 200 BC. It already contains approximately 700 distinct symbols. For comparison, the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphics use fewer than 200 symbols and take centuries to expand their vocabulary. Early Chinese oracle bone script employs roughly 5,000 characters, but those accumulate over a millennium of development. You can track their evolution from simple pictographs to complex characters. Cuneiform 700 symbols appear simultaneously in tablets from multiple cities, suggesting not spontaneous invention in many places at once, but dissemination of an already established system. These aren't pictographs that gradually abstract into symbols. From the earliest examples, cuneiform combines logograms, symbols representing words, with phonetic elements, symbols representing sounds, a hybrid system that usually takes centuries to evolve. Where is the proto-cuneiform? Where are the awkward transitional tablets where scribes are still figuring out how to represent complex ideas? They should exist. Every writing system leaves a trail of developmental debris, ambiguous symbols, inconsistent usage, competing systems tried and abandoned. But Sumerian cuneiform appears standardized, as if someone taught it rather than invented it. This pattern, mature systems appearing without developmental stages, extends across every domain of Sumerian life. Their legal codes, preserved in fragments from the earliest periods, show sophisticated concepts: property rights, contract enforcement, compensation for injuries, inheritance law. These aren't primitive, eye for an eye justice systems. They're nuanced legal frameworks that distinguish between intentional and accidental harm, that recognize different social classes with corresponding obligations, that include appeals processes. Legal systems this complex usually require generations of case law to develop, disputes that reveal gaps in existing rules, edge cases that force refinement. Yet Sumerian law appears comprehensive from its first attestations, as if the framers already understood the full spectrum of human conflict. In every civilization we've studied, sophistication arrives late, the hard-won fruit of centuries of incremental progress. In Sumer, sophistication arrives early, already ripe. Archaeologists call this the Sumerian problem. It's not just that Sumer developed quickly, it's that it doesn't appear to develop at all. Between 3500 and 30 BC, other regions show villages becoming towns. Sumer shows cities appearing with libraries already stocked. Some scholars argue we simply haven't found the earlier stages yet, that erosion, flooding, or the shifting Euphrates River has hidden the gradual development beneath layers of silt. Others suggest that Sumer's development happened elsewhere, in regions now underwater or buried, and what we excavate are already mature colonies. But there's a third possibility, one the Sumerians themselves point to, that they inherited sophistication rather than developed it. That the reason we can't find Proto-Sumerian civilization is because Sumerian civilization is the proto-version, the surviving remnant of something that came before. So if Sumer appeared fully formed with no developmental stages, how did they explain their own origins? The answer is written in one of the most controversial documents ever discovered, a king list that makes no historical sense unless it's something else entirely. In 1906, Hermann Hilprecht was cataloging fragments at the University of Pennsylvania Museum when he noticed something strange about a small clay prism from Nippur. It wasn't a receipt or a hymn. It was a list, a chronological record of every king who had ever ruled Sumer, stretching back to the beginning of time itself. He called it the Sumerian King List, and within a decade, it would become one of the most debated documents in archaeology. The prism is compact, about the size of a tall coffee mug, with columns of cuneiform covering all four sides. Other copies would eventually surface, fragments from Larsa, duplicates from later Babylonian versions found at Nineveh. Each one tells the same story with minor variations in spelling or order, but the core structure remains consistent across centuries and cities. The text begins with a declaration: after kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists the rulers of Eridu: Alulim, who reigned for 28,800 years; Alaulgar, who reigned for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, each ruling for spans that dwarf human lifespans by orders of magnitude. After Eridu come the kings of Bad Tabira, then Larik, then Sapar, then Shuruppak, each city listing rulers whose reigns stretch into the tens of thousands of years. And then, abruptly, the text pivots. The flood swept over. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Everything changes after that line. The post-flood kings rule for decades, maybe a century or two at most, lengths that, while exaggerated, fall within the realm of human possibility. The Tana of Kish reigns for 1,500 years, which is still absurd, but nothing like the 43,200-year reign attributed to Enmen-Lu-Anna of Bad Tabira. Scholars initially dismissed the pre-flood section as pure mythology, a creation story dressed up as history, symbolic figures representing cosmic ages or divine eras before human time properly began. The post-flood kings, by contrast, begin to align with archaeological evidence. Some of the later names match rulers whose inscriptions have been found, whose tombs have been excavated, whose historical existence is independently confirmed. So the standard interpretation became myth transitions to legend, which gradually transitions to history. The impossible reigns are metaphor, the plausible reigns are memory. Somewhere in the middle, fantasy becomes fact. But that interpretation left questions unresolved. Why would the Sumerians frame obvious mythology in the same format as reliable history? Their myths, stories of Gilgamesh battling Humbaba, of Inanna descending to the underworld, don't pretend to be chronological records. They're clearly narrative, poetic, symbolic. The king list, by contrast, reads like bureaucracy. Name, city, reign length, next. No embellishment, no drama, just data. And why do these impossible numbers follow such precise patterns? In the 1960s, scholars began noticing something peculiar. The pre-flood reign lengths aren't random. They're multiples of 3,600, a number the Sumerians called a sar, one of their primary units for measuring vast time spans. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8 sars. Alaugur's 36,000 years equals 10 sars. Enmen-Lu-Anna's 43,200 years, 12 sars. This precision suggests encoding. When you see numbers that consistently hit mathematical benchmarks, you're not reading biography. You're reading calculation. The reigns might represent not individual lifespans, but cycles, epochs, astronomical periods measured in SAR units. Suddenly, the king list transforms from impossible history into possible chronology. The Sumerians were sophisticated astronomers. They tracked Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn with remarkable accuracy. They understood that celestial bodies move in predictable cycles, Venus completing its synodic cycle every 584 days, Saturn taking roughly 30 years to orbit the Sun. Over long observation periods, these cycles create mathematical relationships, conjunctions, oppositions, patterns that repeat. A SAR of 3,600 years is close to certain long-term celestial periods when converted into Sumerian sexagesimal mathematics. Some scholars have proposed that the king list's impossible reigns encode astronomical observations spanning millennia, continuous star watching that would require either institutional memory passed down through countless generations or inherited knowledge from earlier sky watchers. Consider what 43,200 years represents. 12 full SAR cycles. If this encodes something astronomical, perhaps the precession of the equinoxes, which takes roughly 25,920 years to complete a full cycle, or a multiple of planetary conjunctions, then the king list isn't claiming Enmen-Lu-Anna lived for 43,200 years. It's claiming his era corresponded to 12 complete cosmic cycles. The text becomes a calendar, not a biography. This reframing has profound implications. If the pre-flood section records epochs rather than lifespans, then the king list preserves a chronological system that predates Sumerian civilization. It suggests that someone, somewhere, was tracking cosmic time long enough to recognize these cycles, and that the Sumerians inherited this chronology rather than invented it. But here's where the king list becomes truly strange. The flood. The document treats the flood as a discrete historical event, a moment when continuity broke. Everything before it follows one numerical system, the language of epochs and cosmic cycles. Everything after it follows another. The language of human kingship, exaggerated, but recognizable. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again. That phrase, lowered from heaven again, echoes the opening line. Kingship descended from heaven the first time to Eridu, before the flood. After the catastrophe, it descends again to Kish. The repetition suggests cyclical restoration. The world is organized. Catastrophe disrupts it. The world is reorganized. What makes this unsettling is how it aligns with geological evidence. We know from excavations at Shurupik and Kish that a massive flood did strike Mesopotamia, depositing meters-thick layers of silt. We know the flood wasn't global, but within the boundaries of Sumerian experience. It might as well have been. Every city they knew, every field they farmed, submerged under sudden water. The king list describes exactly this, a dividing event that separates two distinct periods, a before and an after, a world where kingship followed cosmic rhythms, and a world where kingship followed human ones. If the pre-flood section encodes astronomical knowledge accumulated over thousands of years, and the flood physically destroyed the civilization that accumulated it, then the king list becomes a salvage document, an attempt to preserve chronological memory across a catastrophe that wiped out the people who understood what the numbers meant. The Sumerians didn't claim to remember what those numbers encoded. They simply copied them faithfully, generation after generation, because the document itself was sacred, a relic from the world before the waters. In the quiet galleries where the king list fragments rest behind glass, you can see where later scribes made copying errors, crossed them out, corrected them. They treated the text with reverence, as though accuracy mattered more than comprehension. They were preserving something they no longer fully understood, which means the king list might be older than Sumer. In the same way, a cathedral built in 1200 AD might contain foundation stones quarried by Romans 8 centuries earlier. The structure is medieval, but the bones remember empire. The king list describes a world before the flood when rulers reigned for impossible lengths of time. But was there really a flood? In the 1920s, an archaeologist digging beneath the city of Ur found something that would change how we read these ancient myths forever. In the winter of 1929, Leonard Woolley stood at the bottom of a trench that had taken his team months to dig. They were beneath the royal cemetery at Ur, hunting for the city's earliest occupation layers, the first modest settlements that would eventually grow into one of Sumer's great capitals. His workers had been pulling up pottery fragments, charcoal from ancient fires, stone tools, the expected debris of early habitation. Then, abruptly, the artifacts stopped. The diggers hit clean clay, sterile, uniform, no trace of human activity. Woolley assumed they'd reached virgin soil, the natural substrate beneath the city. He was about to call the excavation complete when he decided, more from thoroughness than expectation, to dig deeper. 2.5 meters down through that lifeless clay, the artifacts began again. Pottery, flint tools, charcoal. Beneath the flood layer lay another city, another culture, another world entirely. Something had buried it under 8 feet of water, deposited silt. And then, after the waters receded, a new civilization had built directly on top of the remains. Woolley called the trench profile a sandwich of history. Human occupation, catastrophic flood, human occupation. The middle layer wasn't gradual sedimentation from centuries of seasonal flooding. It was deposition from a single overwhelming event, water moving with such force and volume that it scoured the landscape clean, leaving nothing but mud. When Woolley published his findings, he made a claim that generated headlines across the world. He had found evidence of Noah's flood. The biblical reference was dramatic, but the archaeology was sound. The flood layer at Ur dated to roughly 2900 to 3000 B.C., precisely the period when the Sumerian king list describes kingship being lowered from heaven again after the waters swept over. The timing wasn't approximate. It was exact. But Ur wasn't the only site. At Shurupik, the city where the Sumerian flood heroes Yusudra ruled according to myth, excavators found the same sterile clay layer, roughly 2 meters thick, separating earlier occupation from later rebuilding. At Kish, another major Sumerian city, The pattern repeated. Artifacts, flood silt, artifacts. At Eridu, where the king list claims kingship first descended, archaeologists uncovered evidence of abandonment and reconstruction following a major inundation event. Not every Sumerian site shows this layer. Some cities sit on higher ground that the waters never reached. Others were founded after the flood and carry no memory of what came before. But across the low-lying plains where the Tigris and Euphrates converge, the geological testimony is consistent. Around 900 BC, something catastrophic happened. The flood wasn't global. It didn't cover mountains or drown the entire earth, but within the boundaries of Mesopotamian experience, within the world the Sumerians knew, it was total. Every field, every village, every city along the river valleys submerged. For people whose entire universe consisted of the land between two rivers, the flood was the end of the world, and then it appears everywhere. The Hebrew book of Genesis describes Noah building an ark to survive waters that cover the earth for 150 days. God warns him in advance. He brings animals, family, seeds. After the waters recede, humanity begins again with Noah's descendants. The details differ, but the structure remains. Warning, survival, rebuilding. Except Genesis wasn't the original telling. Older than the Hebrew scriptures by over 1,000 years, the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis describes the exact same event with striking parallels. In this version, the gods grow weary of humanity's noise and send a flood to wipe them out. But Enki, the god of wisdom, warns Atrahasis to build a boat. Atrahasis survives with his family and animals. When the waters subside, he makes sacrifice, and the gods, realizing their mistake, allow humanity to continue under new conditions. The Atrahasis text dates to around 1800 BC, but it's copied from older Sumerian sources. The Sumerian version, found in fragments, names the hero Zusudra and places him as king of Shuruppak, the same city where archaeologists found the 2-meter flood layer. The geography matches the geology. The myth matches the mud. Further north, Ugaritic texts from ancient Syria describe Baal battling Am, the sea god who threatens to overwhelm the earth with primordial waters. The cosmology differs, but the underlying memory persists. A time when water nearly destroyed everything. Across the Arabian Sea, Hindu scriptures record the Pralia, a cosmic deluge that ends each age of the world. Manu, warned by a divine fish, builds a boat and preserves the seeds of life. After the waters recede, he repopulates the earth. The Indian version elevates the flood to cosmic necessity, but the core narrative remains. Warning, survival vessel, rebirth, an ocean away. In Mesoamerica, Aztec and Maya texts describe multiple destructions of previous worlds, several by flood. In the Aztec five suns cosmology, the fourth sun ended when the sky rained for 52 years, transforming humans into fish. Only one couple survived to repopulate the fifth world, our current age. These cultures had no contact with Mesopotamia. They developed writing independently, millennia apart, yet they preserve functionally identical stories. A world-ending flood, advance warning from divine sources, a chosen survivor who preserves life, and the rebuilding of civilization in the aftermath. Scholars have long debated how to explain these parallels. Some argue for universal human psychology, that floods are common enough disasters that every culture naturally generates flood mythology. But the details are too consistent. It's not just, there was a flood. It's, there was the flood. The one that divided time into before and after. The one that nearly ended humanity. The one that required divine intervention to survive. Random, independent invention doesn't produce that level of narrative coherence. Another possibility. These stories preserve genuine memory of regional catastrophes. Mesopotamia had its flood around 900 BC. The Indus Valley experienced major flooding. The Mediterranean saw tsunamis from volcanic eruptions. Perhaps each culture documented its own disaster, and the stories later merged and migrated through trade routes. But there's a third option that the archaeology increasingly supports. Something widespread happened at the end of the last ice age. between 12,000 and 10,000 BC, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose over 100 meters worldwide. Coastal settlements, if they existed, drowned beneath what is now shallow seabed. Entire landscapes transformed, ecosystems collapsed and reformed. If humans witnessed that transformation, if they carried stories of the time before the waters came, those memories might have persisted through oral tradition for thousands of years until writing finally captured them. By then, the original event had fractured into regional variants, adapted to local theologies, but retaining the core. Water came. The old world ended. Survivors rebuilt. The Sumerian version might be the oldest written testimony of that memory. The first culture with writing sophisticated enough to document what their ancestors remembered, which means the flood wasn't merely a myth. It was a reset, a moment when continuity shattered and the world began again. And the Sumer that emerged afterward wasn't inventing civilization. It was restoring it from fragments, rebuilding on top of ruins, both physical and cultural. The geological evidence confirms it. Beneath Sumerian cities lies proof of catastrophe, and on Sumerian tablets lies proof that they knew exactly what had been lost. But if the flood destroyed an earlier civilization, how did any knowledge survive at all? How did the Sumerians possess mathematics, astronomy, and architectural sophistication that should have required centuries to develop? The answer might lie in the one thing water cannot wash away: knowledge deliberately preserved. Knowledge so important that someone made certain it survived the rising waters. If you want to know what hour it is, you look at a clock divided into 60 minutes. If you want to measure an angle, you use a circle divided into 360 degrees. If you want to navigate by the stars, you divide the celestial sphere into coordinates based on multiples of 6. You're using Sumerian mathematics. The base 60 system notation appears in the earliest Sumerian tablets, with no preceding developmental stages. No tablets show scribes experimenting with base 8 or base 12 before settling on 60. No evidence of competing systems tried and abandoned. 60 is simply there, already embedded in everything: weights, measures, time, geometry, astronomy, and it's not arbitrary. 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. It's evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it extraordinarily practical for trade, construction, and calculation. Dividing a circle into 360 degrees, 60 times 6, creates a system where angles can be subdivided cleanly for surveying and astronomy. Someone chose 60 deliberately, understanding its mathematical elegance. But who and when? The Sumerians themselves don't claim to have invented it. In their educational texts, clay tablets used to train scribes in the Aduba schools, the standard phrase appears repeatedly: from distant days, the scribal art has been practiced. Not, we developed this art. Not, our teachers created this system. But from distant days, a passive construction that places the origin outside living memory. Among the school exercises found at Nippur are multiplication tables extending into the thousands, division problems using fractions, calculations for compound interest, and geometric formulas for calculating the areas of irregular fields. These aren't rudimentary lessons. They're advanced mathematics taught to children, which means the adults already possess knowledge far beyond basic arithmetic. One tablet, designated YBC 7289 and housed at Yale, shows a square with its diagonals marked. Next to the diagonal is a numerical approximation of the square root of 2, calculated to 6 decimal places: 1.414213. This level of precision requires understanding irrational numbers, a concept that supposedly wasn't formalized until the Greeks 2,000 years later. Yet there it is, scratched into clay by a Sumerian student copying from an older exemplar. The same pattern appears in their medical knowledge. The earliest Sumerian pharmacological texts, collections of remedies and treatments, don't read like early experiments in healing. They read like reference manuals compiled from established practice. A tablet from Nippur dated to around 100 BC contains over a dozen prescriptions using combinations of plants, minerals, and animal products. time for respiratory infections. Willow bark containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin for pain. Fermented grain mixtures for digestive ailments. The text specifies dosages, preparation methods, and expected outcomes with clinical precision. These remedies work. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that many Sumerian medicines contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. This knowledge doesn't emerge overnight. It requires generations of careful observation. Which plants help? Which harm? In what combinations? At what doses? Yet the Sumerian medical corpus appears fully formed in its earliest attestations, as if documenting a tradition that was already ancient. Their metallurgy shows the same sophistication. By 300 BC, Sumerian smiths were producing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that requires precise temperature control and ratio management. Too much tin, and the metal becomes brittle. Too little, and it doesn't harden properly. The optimal ratio is roughly 88% copper to 12% tin. Sumerian bronze consistently hits this ratio. No phase of trial and error casting is preserved in the archaeological record. The earliest bronze artifacts show professional quality metalwork, tools with proper temper, weapons with effective edges, decorative objects with sophisticated craftsmanship. This implies either that the Sumerians learned metallurgy from someone else or that their learning phase happened so early it left no trace, which raises the question of who taught them, or when they had time to teach themselves. Their legal codes suggest similar inheritance. The earliest Sumerian law collections, fragments predating Hammurabi's famous code by centuries, contain complex jurisprudence, laws distinguishing between premeditated and accidental harm, statutes governing property disputes and inheritance rights, regulations for commercial contracts and debt management. Legal systems, this nuance typically evolve through case law, real disputes revealing gaps that subsequent legislation addresses, but Sumerian law appears comprehensive immediately, as if the framers already anticipated the full spectrum of human conflict. And then there's their astronomy. The Ammisaduqa tablets, named after the Babylonian king who commissioned their copying around 650 BC, record observations of Venus over a 21-year period. These aren't mythological descriptions, they're data logs. In month X, day Y, Venus appeared in the east. In month Z, day W, Venus disappeared in the west. The observations are accurate to within a single day across the full cycle. This precision requires continuous monitoring across generations. Sky watchers tracking Venus every night, recording its positions, recognizing patterns. Venus doesn't cooperate with casual observation. It's a synodic period. The time between identical configurations as seen from Earth is roughly 584 days, meaning a complete cycle of patterns takes years to document fully. The Ammisaduqa tablets preserve data that required institutional commitment spanning decades, possibly centuries, and they're copies of older Sumerian originals, meaning the observational tradition extends even further back. Meanwhile, the ziggurats, those massive step pyramids dominating Sumerian cities, weren't purely religious monuments. They were astronomically aligned. The ziggurat at Ur, reconstructed around 100 BC, but built on older foundations, aligns its corners to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. Its stairways face the summer solstice sunrise. Achieving this precision requires understanding the relationship between celestial motion and terrestrial orientation, knowledge of the ecliptic, the celestial equator, and the annual movement of the sun relative to the horizon. It requires instruments for measuring angles and patience for tracking solar positions across seasons. The Sumerians had both. They compiled constellation lists, catalogs of star groupings used for timekeeping and agricultural planning. Some constellations they named are still recognized today. The bull, the lion, the scorpion. These weren't arbitrary patterns. They marked celestial coordinates that helped farmers know when to plant and sailors know which direction to travel. They tracked lunar eclipses, recording them systematically enough to recognize the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. This knowledge requires continuous observation across multiple generations, with records preserved and compared to identify the pattern. All of this, the mathematics, the medicine, the metallurgy, the law, the astronomy, appears in Sumerian civilization without the developmental scaffolding that should precede it. Where are the centuries of failed bronze alloys? Where are the generations of miscalculated eclipse predictions? Where are the early legal codes that don't yet distinguish between accident and intent? They should exist. Knowledge this sophisticated should leave archaeological traces of its development, false starts, dead ends, gradual refinement. But those traces are missing, which returns us to the phrase that whispers through so many Sumerian texts. Knowledge was given, not discovered, not invented, given. The tablets describe a time before the flood when wisdom flowed freely, when divine teachers walked among humans, when the mysteries of the cosmos were revealed rather than puzzled out. We've treated this as mythology, as primitive people attributing their own achievements to gods because they couldn't imagine human ingenuity as sufficient. But what if it's documentation? What if given simply means inherited, passed down from teachers whose names were forgotten, from a time before catastrophe erased continuity? The flood layer at Ur is 2.5 meters thick. Beneath it lies an older civilization with its own pottery styles, its own tool traditions, its own lost knowledge. What if some of that knowledge survived, carried by refugees who fled to higher ground, preserved by oral tradition until writing could capture it, encoded in practices whose origins no one remembered, but everyone maintained? The Sumerians might not have invented their sophistication. They might have inherited it, fragmentary and incomplete, from people who lived before the waters came, which raises the question that defines everything else. Who were those people? Who passed the knowledge on? The answer might lie not in what the Sumerians knew, but in how they spoke, in the language itself, which appears in history as mysteriously as the knowledge it was used to record. Languages evolved the way rivers carve valleys, gradually, visibly, leaving traces of every stage along the way. Latin transforms into Italian, Spanish, French, and Romanian over centuries of phonetic drift and grammatical simplification. We can track these changes through inscriptions, documents, and regional dialects. The process is messy, inconsistent, filled with hybrid forms and transitional stages. A Roman from 100 AD would struggle to understand a Parisian speaking French in 10 AD, but a linguist can bridge that gap by following the breadcrumbs of change. English descends from Old English, which evolved from Proto-Germanic, which emerged from Proto-Indo-European, a language we've reconstructed by comparing its descendants across Europe and Asia. We can trace that lineage back roughly 6,000 years by identifying shared vocabulary, similar grammar, and phonetic patterns that persist across daughter languages. Chinese characters have been used for over 3,000 years, but we can watch their evolution, from pictographic oracle bone scratches to stylized bronze inscriptions to the standardized forms used today. Every stage is documented, every transition preserved. This is how languages work. They come from somewhere. They carry ancestry in their bones. Even when a language dies, it leaves linguistic DNA in the languages that replace it, loanwords, grammatical quirks, phonetic fossils that betray their origins. And then there's Sumerian. Sumerian appears in written form around 300 BC with no precursor, no parent language, no family tree. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives anywhere on Earth. It stands alone, as if it fell from the sky fully formed. This shouldn't be possible. Languages aren't spontaneous creations. They develop from earlier tongues through slow mutation. Even when populations migrate and encounter new environments, their language carries evidence of where they came from, vocabulary borrowed from neighbors, grammar influenced by contact, sound shaped by the languages spoken around them. But Sumerian shows none of this. Its structure bears no resemblance to the Semitic languages that surrounded it. Languages like Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian, which would eventually dominate Mesopotamia. Semitic languages use root systems built from three consonant cores. KTB in Arabic gives you words related to writing. Sumerian doesn't work like this at all. Instead, Sumerian is agglutinative. It builds complex meanings by stringing together smaller morphemes like beads on a chain. Prefixes, suffixes, and affixes attached to root words, modifying meaning and grammatical function. A single Sumerian word can contain what English would express in an entire sentence. Take the word lugal, king, add suffixes, and it becomes lugal e, by the king, ergative case, lugal act, of the king, genitive, lugal ra, to the king, dative. This kind of system resembles languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese more than anything spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. But Turkish, Finnish, and Japanese all have linguistic relatives. We can trace their histories, identify their language families, connect them to earlier forms. Sumerian connects to nothing. Linguists have spent over a century searching for relatives. They've compared Sumerian to Uralic languages, to Dravidian languages in India, to Caucasian languages in Georgia and Armenia. Every hypothesis hits dead ends. The vocabulary doesn't match. The grammar diverges. The phonetic patterns refuse to align. Some researchers propose that Sumerian might be related to ancient Elamite, spoken in what is now southwestern Iran. Both were neighbors. Both existed in the same era. But when scholars analyze the grammar and vocabulary in detail, even that connection dissolved. Sumerian and Elamite are fundamentally different languages that simply happen to coexist geographically. The observations are accurate to within a single day across the full cycle. This precision requires continuous monitoring across generations. Sky watchers tracking Venus every night, recording its positions, recognizing patterns. Venus doesn't cooperate with casual observation. It's a synodic period. The time between identical configurations as seen from Earth is roughly 584 days, meaning a complete cycle of patterns takes years to document fully. The Amisaduka tablets preserve data that required institutional commitment spanning decades, possibly centuries, and they're copies of older Sumerian originals, meaning the observational tradition extends even further back. Meanwhile, the ziggurats, those massive step pyramids dominating Sumerian cities, weren't purely religious monuments. They were astronomically aligned. The ziggurat at Ur, reconstructed around 100 BC, but built on older foundations, aligns its corners to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. Its stairways face the summer solstice sunrise. Achieving this precision requires understanding the relationship between celestial motion and terrestrial orientation, knowledge of the ecliptic, the celestial equator, and the annual movement of the sun relative to the horizon. It requires instruments for measuring angles and patience for tracking solar positions across seasons. The Sumerians had both. They compiled constellation lists, catalogs of star groupings used for timekeeping and agricultural planning. Some constellations they named are still recognized today. The bull, the lion, the scorpion. These weren't arbitrary patterns. They marked celestial coordinates that helped farmers know when to plant and sailors know which direction to travel. They tracked lunar eclipses, recording them systematically enough to recognize the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. This knowledge requires continuous observation across multiple generations, with records preserved and compared to identify the pattern. All of this, the mathematics, the medicine, the metallurgy, the law, the astronomy, appears in Sumerian civilization without the developmental scaffolding that should precede it. Where are the centuries of failed bronze alloys? Where are the generations of miscalculated eclipse predictions? Where are the early legal codes that don't yet distinguish between accident and intent? They should exist. Knowledge this sophisticated should leave archaeological traces of its development, false starts, dead ends, gradual refinement. But those traces are missing, which returns us to the phrase that whispers through so many Sumerian texts. Knowledge was given, not discovered, not invented, given. The tablets describe a time before the flood when wisdom flowed freely, when divine teachers walked among humans, when the mysteries of the cosmos were revealed rather than puzzled out. We've treated this as mythology, as primitive people attributing their own achievements to gods because they couldn't imagine human ingenuity as sufficient. But what if it's documentation? What if given simply means inherited, passed down from teachers whose names were forgotten, from a time before catastrophe erased continuity? The flood layer at Ur is 2.5 meters thick. Beneath it lies an older civilization with its own pottery styles, its own tool traditions, its own lost knowledge. What if some of that knowledge survived, carried by refugees who fled to higher ground, preserved by oral tradition until writing could capture it, encoded in practices whose origins no one remembered, but everyone maintained? The Sumerians might not have invented their sophistication. They might have inherited it, fragmentary and incomplete, from people who lived before the waters came, which raises the question that defines everything else. Who were those people? Who passed the knowledge on? The answer might lie not in what the Sumerians knew, but in how they spoke, in the language itself, which appears in history as mysteriously as the knowledge it was used to record. Languages evolved the way rivers carve valleys, gradually, visibly, leaving traces of every stage along the way. Latin transforms into Italian, Spanish, French, and Romanian over centuries of phonetic drift and grammatical simplification. We can track these changes through inscriptions, documents, and regional dialects. The process is messy, inconsistent, filled with hybrid forms and transitional stages. A Roman from 100 AD would struggle to understand a Parisian speaking French in 10 AD, but a linguist can bridge that gap by following the breadcrumbs of change. English descends from Old English, which evolved from Proto-Germanic, which emerged from Proto-Indo-European, a language we've reconstructed by comparing its descendants across Europe and Asia. We can trace that lineage back roughly 6,000 years by identifying shared vocabulary, similar grammar, and phonetic patterns that persist across daughter languages. Chinese characters have been used for over 3,000 years, but we can watch their evolution, from pictographic oracle bone scratches to stylized bronze inscriptions to the standardized forms used today. Every stage is documented, every transition preserved. This is how languages work. They come from somewhere. They carry ancestry in their bones. Even when a language dies, it leaves linguistic DNA in the languages that replace it, loanwords, grammatical quirks, phonetic fossils that betray their origins. And then there's Sumerian. Sumerian appears in written form around 300 BC with no precursor, no parent language, no family tree. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives anywhere on Earth. It stands alone, as if it fell from the sky fully formed. This shouldn't be possible. Languages aren't spontaneous creations. They develop from earlier tongues through slow mutation. Even when populations migrate and encounter new environments, their language carries evidence of where they came from. Vocabulary borrowed from neighbors, grammar influenced by contact, sound shaped by the languages spoken around them. But Sumerian shows none of this. Its structure bears no resemblance to the Semitic languages that surrounded it. Languages like Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian, which would eventually dominate Mesopotamia. Semitic languages use root systems built from 3 consonant cores. KTB in Arabic gives you words related to writing. Sumerian doesn't work like this at all. Instead, Sumerian is agglutinative. It builds complex meanings by stringing together smaller morphemes like beads on a chain. Prefixes, suffixes, and infixes attached to root words, modifying meaning and grammatical function. A single Sumerian word can contain what English would express in an entire sentence. Take the word Lugal, king, add suffixes, and it becomes Lugal e, by the king, ergative case, Lugal act, of the king, genitive, Lugal ra, to the king, dative. This kind of system resembles languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese more than anything spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. But Turkish, Finnish, and Japanese all have linguistic relatives. We can trace their histories, identify their language families, connect them to earlier forms. Sumerian connects to nothing. Linguists have spent over a century searching for relatives. They've compared Sumerian to Uralic languages, to Dravidian languages in India, to Caucasian languages in Georgia and Armenia. Every hypothesis, it's dead ends. The vocabulary doesn't match. The grammar diverges. The phonetic patterns refuse to align. Some researchers propose that Sumerian might be related to ancient Elamite, spoken in what is now southwestern Iran. Both were neighbors. Both existed in the same era, but when scholars analyze the grammar and vocabulary in detail, even that connection dissolved. Sumerian and Elamite are fundamentally different languages that simply happen to coexist geographically. The only explanation linguists have settled on is that Sumerian represents the last survivor of a language family that went extinct, a linguistic lineage whose other branches disappeared without trace, leaving Sumerian isolated in time. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If Sumerians' relatives vanished, when did they vanish? And why is there no archaeological evidence of the people who spoke those related languages? Unless those people lived before the flood. The timing aligns disturbingly well. Sumerian appears in writing around 300 BC. The flood layers at Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish date to roughly 900 BC. If Sumerian was already being spoken before the catastrophe, if it was the language of the cities buried beneath the flood silt, then its isolation makes sense. The disaster that deposited 2.5 meters of sterile clay also erased the linguistic context that would have made Sumerian comprehensible. We'd be looking at the last surviving dialect of a drowned language family. What makes this possibility more intriguing is how Sumerian grammar behaves. Linguists have noted peculiarities that suggest substrate influence, traces of an older language affecting Sumerian structure. Some grammatical features don't fit cleanly into agglutinative patterns. Certain word orders seem borrowed. Specific phonetic quirks appear inconsistent with the rest of the language. It's as if Sumerian itself is a hybrid, a language that absorbed elements from an earlier tongue, preserving fossilized structures whose origins are now lost. Languages do this when speakers of two different languages intermarry, or when a dominant culture imposes its speech on a conquered population. The resulting hybrid carries ghosts of both parents. If Sumerian shows substrate influence, what was the substrate? What earlier language left its fingerprints in Sumerian grammar? We'll never know, because whatever it was, it's gone. What we do know is that Sumerian didn't die easily. Even after Akkadian, a Semitic language brought by new populations, became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia around 500 BC, Sumerian persisted. Scribes continued learning it in schools. Priests continued using it in temples. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian and Akkadian coexisted. Akkadian for daily life, Sumerian for scholarship and ritual. By 200 BC, Sumerian had stopped being anyone's native language. No children learned it at home, yet it remained essential. Babylonian kings commissioned Sumerian inscriptions to legitimize their rule. Scholars copied Sumerian texts to preserve ancient wisdom. Temples maintained Sumerian liturgies because they believed the gods preferred the old tongue. Sumerian became what Latin would become to medieval Europe, a sacred language, the key to older knowledge, the speech of ancestors who understood truths modernity had forgotten. Babylonian scribes created bilingual dictionaries, painstakingly translating Sumerian texts into Akkadian so the knowledge wouldn't be lost. They treated Sumerian with reverence, as though its words held power that transcended mere communication. One scribe, copying a Sumerian hymn around 1800 BC, added a note in Akkadian. The ancient words must not be altered. They contain the wisdom before the great change. What great change? The flood, the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance, something older still? The Babylonians themselves didn't know. They simply understood that Sumerian mattered, that preserving it meant preserving access to something essential. Even as their own language evolved and their empire expanded, they kept Sumerian alive in schools, libraries, and temples for another 2,000 years. The last cuneiform tablet ever written, dated to 75 AD, during the Roman Empire, contained Sumerian phrases. By then, Sumerian had been dead as a living language for over 2,000 years, yet someone, somewhere in Mesopotamia, still thought it worth writing down. What were they trying to preserve? Perhaps Sumerian wasn't just a language. Perhaps it was a time capsule, the last linguistic remnant of a world that existed before the waters came, before catastrophe fractured continuity, before the people who spoke related languages disappeared beneath the flood silt that Leonard Woolley would excavate 4,000 years later. If Sumerian is a fossil, then the language itself becomes evidence proof that something existed before Sumer, something sophisticated enough to develop complex grammar, something organized enough to require written communication, something that vanished so completely that only echoes survive in a tongue no one understands the origins of. Is Sumerian a fossil of a pre-flood language? The answer might lie not in grammar or vocabulary, but in what the Sumerians used that grammar and vocabulary to describe. Stories that sound less like imagination and more like testimony, myths that read less like poetry and more like memory, translated into the only form that could survive catastrophe. Most creation myths begin with God speaking worlds into existence, a word, a breath, a command, and reality obeys. The Hindu Rig Veda describes creation emerging from cosmic sound. The Hebrew Genesis has God saying, "Let there be light," and light complies. These are stories of divine will manifesting instantly, perfectly, without struggle. Sumerian creation myths don't work like that. They describe problems, mistakes, iterations, adjustments made across multiple attempts before anything functional emerges. If these texts are myths, they're unusually honest about failure. And if they're metaphors, they're remarkably specific about process. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1-800 BC from older Sumerian sources, opens not with humanity, but with divine labor disputes. The younger gods, the Igigi, are exhausted from maintaining the world. They dig irrigation channels, dredge rivers, build temples. After 3,600 years, one SAR cycle, they revolt. They burn their tools, march on the assembly of elder gods, and demand relief. The elder gods convene. They need workers, but they can't force divine beings to labor eternally. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposes a solution. Let a birth goddess create offspring. Let man assume the drudgery of the gods. But creating humans isn't instantaneous. It requires experimentation. The goddess Nintu, also called Belit Ili, Lady of the Gods, collaborates with Enki to fashion the first prototype. They take clay from the Apsu, the primordial freshwater abyss beneath the earth. They mix it with the blood of Weila, a slain god, whose essence, or ghost, provides something the clay alone cannot. The text is explicit about ingredients: clay, physical matter; divine blood, animating essence; the womb of the birth goddess, the vessel where mixing occurs. Then Ninta begins the process. She pinches off clay. She mixes it with the divine essence. She shapes forms. And then she makes 7 beings. But they're defective. The Enki and Ninmah text, a separate creation account preserved on tablets from Nippur, describes this phase in uncomfortable detail. Ninmah creates the first human, but something goes wrong. The being cannot hold back urine. Enki assigns it a role anyway, a servant who needs no control. She creates another. This one cannot close its mouth, cannot speak clearly. Enki gives it a job as a musician. No speech required. A third has poor eyesight. Enki assigns tasks that don't need vision. A fourth has paralyzed hands. Again, Enki finds a function. The text continues through multiple flawed prototypes, beings with physical and cognitive defects, each one given specialized roles based on their limitations. It reads less like divine poetry and more like a clinical record. Attempt, defect, adaptation, next attempt. This is quality control documentation. Eventually, the process stabilizes. Nintu and Enki refine their technique. They produce functional humans capable of reproduction, labor, and maintenance of civilization. The text describes 14 birth goddesses, 7 creating males, 7 creating females, establishing reproductive populations rather than a single breeding pair. The language throughout is procedural. The gods don't wave hands and speak humans into existence. They mix, shape, test, adjust, and iterate. There's craftsmanship here, not miracle; engineering, not magic. What makes this even stranger is the purpose. Humans aren't created for companionship, moral testing, or worship, at least not initially. They're created to work, to dig canals, to maintain temples, to perform the agricultural and infrastructural labor the gods find tedious. Let man bear the yoke. Let him carry the basket of the gods. This isn't theological poetry about humanity's sacred purpose. It's a job description and the divine essence mixed into the clay. The text calls it temu, a word that can mean intelligence, consciousness, understanding. The blood of Wheela contains something that transforms inert clay into thinking beings. The myth doesn't explain what temu is biologically, but it treats it as a transferable substance, something that can be mixed, shared, inherited. We read this as metaphor because the alternative is too strange, that the Sumerians were attempting to document a process they'd witnessed or inherited knowledge of, encoding it in the only framework available to them, mythic narrative, where gods do the work humans observe. But consider the structure. Creation myths from other cultures describe instantaneous perfection. The Judeo-Christian Genesis has God creating humans complete and functional on the sixth day. The Greek Prometheus molds humans from earth and gives them fire. But there's no intermediate stage of failed prototypes. Egyptian creation myths have cuneiform humans on a potter's wheel, each one emerging perfectly formed. Only Sumerian creation accounts include failure, adjustment, and incremental improvement, the hallmarks of experimentation. Scholars interpret this as philosophical reflection on human imperfection. The flawed early humans represent the range of human disabilities and limitations, and the myth functions as social commentary. Even imperfect beings have value and roles. But why structure it as sequential experimentation? Why include trial and error at all if the point is simply to acknowledge human diversity? Unless the structure itself is the memory. The ancient world had no concept of genetics, no vocabulary for heredity beyond bloodline, no framework for understanding biological inheritance. If someone from a pre-literate culture observed selective breeding, whether of animals or something else, how would they describe it? They'd need metaphor. They'd need narrative containers for processes they perceived but couldn't explain scientifically. The gods mixed clay with divine essence might be the only way to say someone combined elements to create new forms. They made mistakes and corrected them might be the only way to preserve. There was a process involving failure and refinement. The texts themselves encouraged this reading. They're procedural, not poetic. They describe steps, sequences, outcomes. They sound less like spiritual allegory and more like technical documentation translated into mythological language, because no other language existed yet. What if the Sumerians inherited knowledge of human origins, not complete understanding, but fragmented memory of observations made before writing existed to record them properly? What if those memories survived through oral tradition until the first scribes tried to capture them in cuneiform? They couldn't write. A deliberate process involving selection and refinement produced modern humans. They didn't have those words. They didn't have that conceptual framework, but they could write. The gods shaped us from earth and essence, tried and failed, then tried again until we worked. And so they did. The creation tablets don't claim humanity arose by chance or divine whim. They claim humanity was made deliberately, carefully, through a process that required knowledge, skill, and multiple attempts. The gods in these stories aren't distant cosmic forces. They're active participants with specific roles. Enki provides wisdom. Ninta provides the biological vessel. Lesser deities carry out the work. If we strip away the divine names and read these as process documents, as records of how rather than who, the texts become testimony. Someone, somewhere, understood enough about life to shape it intentionally, and the Sumerians preserved that understanding in the only format that could survive without scientific terminology: myth. Did the Sumerians encode humanity's origin story in mythic language because it was the only way they could preserve it? The question leads directly to the next. Who were these gods who possessed such knowledge? The Sumerians had a name for them, repeated across every text, every temple, every astronomical record. They called them the Anunnaki, and their role in Sumerian civilization was far more complex than modern retellings suggest. In a cylinder seal from dated to around 600 BC, 7 figures sit in judgment. They're arranged in formal hierarchy, robed and bearded, holding symbols of authority. Above them, a single line of cuneiform identifies them, the Anunnaki, the great gods who decree fate. They appear across thousands of texts, carved into temple walls, pressed into clay tablets, invoked in hymns and legal formulas. They're not abstract cosmic forces. They have names, genealogies, responsibilities, and relationships. They argue, compete, form alliances, and occasionally make catastrophic mistakes. They're portrayed as rulers, but rulers who once walked among humans. The Sumerian term Anunnaki breaks down linguistically as Anunnaki, offspring of Anu, the sky god who presides over the divine assembly. They function as the administrative tier of the cosmos, judges who determine destinies, lawgivers who establish order, managers who oversee the operation of the world. But their roles aren't vague or symbolic. The text assign them specific portfolios. Enki, chief among the Anunnaki, governs fresh water, wisdom, and craftsmanship. He teaches humans irrigation, mathematics, and writing. Enlil controls wind, storms, and agriculture. He determines when crops succeed or fail. Inanna commands war, love, and the movements of Venus. Utu presides over justice and the sun's daily course. Ninhursag oversees birth and the fertility of the land. These aren't distant, unreachable deities. They're active participants in Sumerian life, credited with establishing cities, introducing technologies, and instructing humanity in the arts of civilization. One hymn from Nippur states, Enki placed in order the divine decrees. He made the earth produce. He spread the pickaxe and the basket. He laid the foundations for the settlements. Not symbolic foundations, actual infrastructure. Pickaxes and baskets aren't metaphors. They're tools. The text describes Enki teaching humans how to dig, how to carry, how to build. Another tablet records Enlil's gift to humanity. Enlil brought forth the seed of the land from the earth. He organized the work of plowing and sowing. He set the cattle pens and sheepfolds in order. Again, practical instruction, animal husbandry, agriculture, the skills necessary for settled civilization. What makes the Anunnaki strange is how they're portrayed. They're powerful, yes, but not omnipotent. They grow tired. They make errors. They need help. They convene councils to debate decisions. They eat and drink, experience love and jealousy, form grudges and reconcile. In the creation myths, they grow exhausted from maintaining the world and create humans to share the burden. In the flood narratives, they regret their decision to destroy humanity and mourn the loss. They're not transcendent beings operating outside time. They're embedded within it, subject to consequence and limitation. This has led some scholars to propose a controversial interpretation that the Anunnaki weren't purely mythological, but represented something historical, perhaps ancestral elites, pre-flood leaders, or a ruling class whose memory was preserved and gradually elevated into divine status over centuries of retelling. Ancestor deification is common across cultures. The Romans declared emperors divine after death. The Chinese venerated imperial ancestors as godlike figures. Egyptian pharaohs were considered living gods, intermediaries between humanity and the cosmic order. If the Anunnaki were originally revered ancestors, survivors of the pre-flood world, perhaps, who preserved crucial knowledge, they could have been mythologized into gods as memory faded and distance increased. The structure of Sumerian theology supports this reading. Unlike monotheistic systems where God exists outside creation, the Anunnaki inhabit the world. They live in temples, physical structures requiring maintenance. They consume food offerings brought by worshippers. They have offspring who intermarry with humans, producing hybrid lineages. The Sumerian king list describes certain early kings as children of divine parents, human mothers, Anunnaki fathers. This blending of mortal and divine bloodlines appears repeatedly in Sumerian genealogies, suggesting either mythological legitimation of royal power or genuine belief that certain lineages descended from pre-flood elites who married into post-flood populations. What makes this interpretation more compelling is how similar figures appear across unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and millennia. In Egypt, the Neteru, often translated as gods, are portrayed in temple inscriptions as teachers who arrived in pre-dynastic times to establish law, agriculture, and astronomy, like the Anunnaki. They're shown with human characteristics, engaging in recognizably human activities, interacting directly with early Egyptians. In Hindu tradition, the devas, celestial beings who shape reality, descend periodically to instruct humanity during transitions between cosmic ages. They teach sacred knowledge, establish Dharma cosmic law, and guide civilization through cycles of creation and destruction. They're neither fully divine nor fully mortal, but occupy an intermediate status. Mesoamerican cultures describe sky teachers who descended to instruct humanity after previous worlds were destroyed by flood and fire. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, brings writing, mathematics, astronomy, and agriculture, the same portfolio attributed to Enki in Sumerian texts. Viracocha in Incan mythology performs identical functions, appearing after catastrophe to rebuild civilization. Greek mythology preserves the Titans, primordial beings who ruled before the Olympian gods, who taught humans fire, metalwork, agriculture, and law. Prometheus, a Titan, defies Zeus to give humanity knowledge, suffering eternal punishment for bridging the gap between divine and mortal understanding. Early Jewish texts mention the Watchers, angels who descended to earth, intermarried with humans, and taught forbidden knowledge. Metalworking, cosmetics, astrology, warfare. The Book of Enoch describes them explicitly as teachers, providing humanity with skills that accelerated civilization, but also corrupted it. These parallels are striking not because the stories are identical, but because the narrative structure repeats. Advanced beings descend from elsewhere, interact with humanity, provide knowledge that enables civilization, then either depart or are removed by catastrophe or divine intervention. Independent invention should produce more variation. If every culture spontaneously generated sky teacher myths, we'd expect wildly different details. Some would be animals, some would be elemental forces, some wouldn't be teachers at all, but tricksters or destroyers. Instead, the pattern holds. Anthropomorphic figures with knowledge arrive from above or beyond, establish civilization's foundations, then fade into myth. Scholars traditionally explain this through diffusion theory. One original myth spread through trade routes, adapting to local cultures. But the geographical distances are too vast, the time gaps too long, and the narrative core too consistent for simple cultural borrowing. The alternative, shared ancestral memory, fits better. If something significant happened in humanity's deep past, if knowledge was transmitted from an earlier culture to later ones, the memory of those transmitters might persist globally, adapted into local mythologies, but retaining the essential truth. Someone taught us. The Sumerians called those teachers the Anunnaki. The Egyptians called them Neteru. The Hindus called them Devas. The Mesoamericans called them sky serpents. Different names, same function. Maybe we've been reading these accounts backward. Maybe the gods weren't invented to explain the mysteries of existence. Maybe they were invented to preserve the memory of people who did explain those mysteries. People who possessed knowledge worth remembering, whose names were eventually lost, but whose legacy survived, encoded in divine form. The Anunnaki, in this reading, become testimony, the Sumerian attempt to document who taught them, who gave them the knowledge that appeared too sophisticated to have developed locally, who they remembered as bringers of civilization rather than as creators, which returns us to the question that has haunted every chapter. What did the Sumerians remember about humanity's teachers? And more urgently, what if they weren't remembering myth at all, but history, fragmented, mythologized, but fundamentally grounded in events that actually occurred before the flood swept over and kingship was lowered from heaven again? To answer that, we need to gather every thread we've followed: the sudden appearance, the inherited knowledge, the isolate language, the procedural creation myths, the global parallels, and ask the one question the Sumerians never stopped asking themselves: where did we truly come from? Somewhere in a climate-controlled archive, a Sumerian tablet rests in foam padding. The clay is cool to the touch, slightly rough where the surface has weathered over millennia. If you were allowed to hold it, and you won't be. But imagine, you could feel the ridges of cuneiform pressed into its face, and if you looked closely at the edges, you'd see them, thumbprints, preserved in the clay before it dried. The person who made those prints lived before pyramids, before philosophy, before any empire we can name. They pressed their thumb into wet clay while recording something they believed mattered enough to outlast them. They were right. We've traced their message across 9 chapters, following threads that refuse to stay neatly contained in the box labeled mythology. Each thread pulls us toward the same uncomfortable conclusion: that the Sumerians weren't describing the birth of civilization, they were documenting its restoration. Consider what we've assembled: a civilization that appears fully formed, with no developmental stages, cities, mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine emerging simultaneously, as if unpacked from storage rather than invented from scratch. This violates every model we have for how cultures evolve. Yet the archaeological record confirms it. Sumer doesn't climb the ladder of progress. It starts near the top, a king list that encodes astronomical cycles in range no human could survive, preserving chronology in the only format that could survive catastrophe, numbers, and names that later scribes would copy faithfully even when they no longer understood what the numbers meant. The list divides history into before and after, separated by water that actually came, depositing meters of sterile silt across every city the Sumerians knew, a language that appears without ancestry, without relatives, without the gradual evolution that defines every other tongue we've studied. Sumerian stands alone in linguistic history, a fossil of a speech community that vanished so completely that only this one dialect survived, preserved because someone wrote it down before the speakers disappeared. Creation myths that read less like poetry and more like process documentation, trial and error, failed prototypes, incremental refinement, described with procedural precision, not let there be humans. But we mixed these elements, encountered these problems, made these adjustments. The language of experimentation translated into the only vocabulary available: the actions of gods, astronomical knowledge that requires centuries of continuous observation, appearing complete in the earliest tablets, mathematical systems so elegant they're still embedded in how we measure time and space, medical understanding that actually works, confirmed by modern pharmacology, legal frameworks sophisticated enough to handle complex social disputes, all of it inherited, not invented, all of it described as given. And the Anunnaki, teachers, judges, bringers of knowledge, portrayed not as distant cosmic forces, but as beings who lived among humans, who established the foundations of civilization, who descended from heaven, and then faded into memory until only their names remain, elevated into divinity as the centuries transformed witnesses into worshippers. What if none of this is mythology? What if the Sumerians were exactly what they claim to be: archivists of an earlier age, custodians of knowledge that survived catastrophe, scribes documenting what their ancestors told them about the world before the flood? The flood is the pivot point, the moment when continuity shattered. Before it, a culture sophisticated enough to develop base 60 mathematics, precise astronomy, complex language, and practical engineering. After it, survivors rebuilding from fragments, preserving what they could, passing down stories that gradually transformed from testimony into myth as the original context drowned beneath silt and time. We keep expecting the Sumerians to tell us they invented civilization. They keep telling us they restored it. We've spent 150 years insisting they must be speaking metaphorically, because the alternative rewrites everything we thought we knew about humanity's timeline. But what if they meant it literally? What if the clay tablets aren't imaginative literature, but documentary evidence, the earliest surviving testimony about who we are and where we came from, recorded by people who knew they were the last generation that remembered? Every wedge-shaped mark pressed into wet clay is a message from a world that no longer exists, transmitted across 5,000 years by scribes who believed what they were writing mattered. They called it restoration. They called it memory. They said knowledge was given. Kingship descended from heaven. Humanity was shaped from earth and divine essence before the waters came and everything changed. We called it myth because we couldn't imagine it being anything else. But myths don't leave fingerprints in clay. Myths don't encode astronomical observations accurate to within a day. Myths don't preserve mathematical systems still functional after 5 millennia. Myths don't create language isolates with no developmental history. Memory does. Did the Sumerians record humanity's true origin? And have we spent centuries mistaking memory for myth? The desert wind still moves across the ruins of Eridu, carrying grains of ancient mud brick into the Iraqi sky. Beneath the sand, clay tablets wait, thousands more, still unexcavated, stories still unread, testimonies still silent. And somewhere in the darkness of museum archives, those fingerprints remain, the pulse of a scribe who lived 6,000 years ago, frozen in clay, reaching across time to tell us something we've forgotten how to hear. Maybe it's time we started listening.